The grotesque endurance of a human body, when pushed to the edge of agony, does not surrender quickly. Nerves scream long after the mind has given up. The heart can keep pumping, the lungs can keep heaving, and the brain can remain aware fully, painfully aware, even as it is being torn apart from the inside. This gruesome resilience isn't a mercy. It's a design flaw, one that medieval executioners learned to exploit with surgical precision. And no execution in British history embodies this cruel science better than the fate of Sir William Wallace, the man English scribes once called a traitor and Scots a patriot. Wallace's death has been sanitized by history, romanticized in film, and reduced to a footnote in stories of Scottish resistance. But the truth, the real, physical, unspeakably calculated destruction of William Wallace, remains almost too graphic for history textbooks. He was not simply executed. He was ritually dismembered, psychologically broken, and publicly humiliated in one of the most sophisticated displays of state-sponsored torture ever recorded in the medieval world. What happened to William Wallace on August 23, 1305, at Smithfield in London, was not just the killing of a man. It was the symbolic obliteration of an entire movement. His death was a performance, a lesson carved into flesh, a message written in blood, meticulously crafted to terrorize a people into submission and make resistance seem not just fatal but unbearable. This wasn't about justice, it was about domination. It was about what a terrified empire does when faced with a man it cannot control. Wallace's execution was a process, not an event. It unfolded in stages, each more depraved than the last, each step designed to strip him not just of life, but of identity, dignity, and legacy. You may think you've heard this story before, but you haven't. What you've heard is a version shaped by centuries of censorship and strategic forgetting. To understand the true horror of Wallace's final hours, we must peel away the legends, the nationalism, the film scripts, and the folklore. We must go inside the psychological machine that turned his death into public theater. We must watch as a man is systematically unmade, not just by sword and rope, but by fear, spectacle, and the cold precision of political messaging. This is not the story of a martyr. It is the story of a deconstruction. This is the real execution of William Wallace. To many today, William Wallace is a name carved into the mythology of freedom, a defiant warrior whose last breath whispered liberty into the soul of a nation. But before he was legend, he was an inconvenient man, a political problem, and more dangerously, a man who had slipped the leash. Wallace emerged during one of the most volatile chapters in British history, a time when Scotland was leaderless, fractured, and slowly being absorbed under the crushing weight of Edward I's ambition. The English king, known as Hammer of the Scots, didn't just want to conquer Scotland. He wanted it to surrender itself, to believe that submission was inevitable, even moral. But William Wallace refused to play along. He wasn't nobility, wasn't polished, didn't come from the elite military caste that usually defined rebellion in medieval Europe. He was a commoner, a landowner's son, untitled, untrained in courtly diplomacy, and therefore unpredictable. And that made him lethal. William Wallace emerged during one of the most volatile chapters in British history, a time when Scotland was leaderless, fractured, and slowly being absorbed under the crushing weight of Edward I's ambition. The English king, known as the Hammer of the Scots, didn't just want to conquer Scotland. He wanted it to surrender itself, to believe that submission was inevitable, even moral. But William Wallace refused to play along. His rise was unconventional. He wasn't nobility, wasn't polished, and didn't come from the elite military caste that usually defined rebellion in medieval Europe. He was a commoner, a landowner's son, untitled, and untrained in courtly diplomacy, and therefore unpredictable. That unpredictability made him lethal. In 1297, Wallace led a guerrilla campaign that embarrassed England on a scale bordering on absurd. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, a vastly outnumbered force of Scots under Wallace's command annihilated a professional English army. This defeat humiliated Edward's generals, men trained in chivalric warfare who had been outwitted by a so-called outlaw. Worse, the victory gave Wallace something far more dangerous than battlefield success: mythic power. He was knighted, declared guardian of Scotland, and for a brief moment, William Wallace, the unlikeliest of rebels, became the voice of a nation refusing to be broken. His unexpected victories solidified his place not just as a leader, but as a burgeoning legend. When William Wallace was finally betrayed and captured in August 1305, it wasn't by English knights in heroic combat. Instead, it was through a quiet, backroom surrender orchestrated by John de Menteith, a Scottish nobleman who had aligned himself with Edward I. There was no grand battle, no valiant standoff. Wallace was simply taken. What transpired next, however, revealed the full, calculated cruelty of a medieval justice system weaponized by a state desperate to erase not just a person, but a potent symbol. Wallace was immediately shackled, not merely restrained, but visibly and emphatically dehumanized. He was paraded like livestock from Scotland all the way to London, a slow, humiliating journey meticulously staged for maximum public exposure. Along the route, he was deliberately displayed, not hidden, as English citizens were actively encouraged to mock, spit, and jeer at the prisoner. He was forced to ride while bound, often bareback, ensuring constant pain and exhaustion. Accounts suggest Wallace was deliberately starved and denied sleep, not due to logistical failures, but as a strategic intent to break him down. This wasn't merely transportation. It was a process of psychological erosion. By the time Wallace reached London, he was already breaking, not in body, but in mind. The spectacle had begun long before the scaffold was even erected. The streets of London did not receive him with shock, but with a celebratory fervor. To the English public, propaganda had done its work, painting Wallace as a monster, a traitor, a barbarian, even a heretic. People lined the roads, not to mourn a fallen soldier, but to witness a monster being brought to slaughter, absorbing every planned insult and indignity. The trial that followed William Wallace's humiliating journey to London was, in truth, not a legal proceeding in any genuine sense. Instead, it was a ritual scripted from beginning to end, a meticulously orchestrated piece of political theater designed to legitimize his predetermined condemnation. On August 23, 1305, Wallace stood before a special court convened at Westminster Hall, the very seat of royal justice. Yet, he was not allowed to speak freely, nor to call witnesses, nor to present any evidence in his defense. His fate was sealed before a single word was uttered. He was accused of a litany of charges: treason against Edward I, murder of English civilians and soldiers, sacrilege against the church, and barbaric warfare unbecoming a knight. This last charge was particularly revealing. Wallace was being condemned not just for what he did, but for how he did it. His unconventional tactics, ambushes, night raids, attacking supply lines, had deeply embarrassed and unsettled the English military establishment. He fought like a phantom, and now they intended to punish him like one. When the accusation of treason was read aloud, Wallace responded with a defiant clarity that cut through centuries of propaganda. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." That single, powerful act of defiance was an unpardonable sin. It was a direct denial of the king's authority, not just over Wallace himself, but over his very legitimacy in Scotland. This declaration transformed Wallace from a mere criminal into an existential threat to the English crown. From that moment forward, his execution was no longer about justice. It was about annihilation. The court neither deliberated nor hesitated. Wallace was found guilty, a foregone conclusion, and sentenced not merely to death, but to a horrific sequence of deaths. Each act of the sentence, to be hanged until nearly dead, then emasculated, eviscerated, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered, carried profound symbolic meaning, meticulously designed to dismantle both his body and his legacy in the most memorable and terrifying way possible. The trial, like the execution, was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be unforgettable, a stark lesson etched in blood for anyone daring to challenge imperial power. There are many ways to kill a man, but few are as cruel or as calculated as dragging him through the streets of a city that hates him, letting every agonizing step become a lesson in humiliation. William Wallace's final journey to the scaffold began not with a prayer, but with a rope. Stripped nearly naked, he was bound at the wrists and ankles, tied to the back of a horse, not on it, but behind it, and dragged through the teeming, filthy streets of London. This was no accident of medieval brutality. It was policy. The sentence to be drawn meant precisely this: to be publicly hauled through mud, dung, filth, and human waste, exposed to the jeers, the thrown rocks, and the cold indifference of a crowd conditioned to treat his agony as theater. The route chosen was deliberate, designed for maximum impact. From the Tower of London, through the busiest districts, Wallace was paraded before the people like a living corpse. Every jolt of the rough, cobblestone road snapped his bones against the wooden slats. Every sharp turn revealed new faces in the surging crowd, some curious, some gleeful, many openly hostile. He was not yet dying, but he was being meticulously prepared for death, like an animal fattened for slaughter, except in reverse. He was being weakened, both emotionally and physically, so that when the actual killing finally began, resistance would be impossible. The dragging took hours, not because of distance, but because the slower the process, the better. Each painful bump and scrape over cobblestones, each puddle of refuse, each jeering voice added to the profound psychological erosion. To the people of London, Wallace had become a cautionary tale in motion, a living symbol of what happens when a man dares to defy the crown, not just through violence, but through conviction. Imagine the cacophony, the low rumble of thousands watching, shouting, some laughing, others indifferently observing. Imagine the stench, the pervasive smell of filth, blood, sweat, and unwashed bodies, overwhelming the senses. Imagine the confusion, the sensory chaos of dying before one is truly dead. For Wallace, this wasn't merely a journey to an end. It was the harrowing beginning of a ritual erasure. Edward I didn't want William Wallace simply dead. He wanted him utterly destroyed, reduced piece by piece from man to monster to nothing. Even the location of the execution was chosen with chilling symbolism in mind. Smithfield, a place traditionally used for livestock markets and public executions. The message was explicit. Wallace would not die as a knight or even as a dignified man. He would die as meat, butchered in public for a hungry crowd, then carved up and distributed like refuse. And yet, despite this unfathomable ordeal, Wallace reportedly remained silent. He did not beg. He did not cry out. If he trembled, it was from raw pain, not fear. But silence is not the same as peace. It is often the final coping mechanism of a mind that has already begun to shatter. By the time he arrived at Smithfield, covered in cuts, bruises, excrement, and humiliation, Wallace had already endured a profound psychological execution. The man was still alive, but his autonomy, his dignity, and his public voice had been systematically stripped away. What followed would not be a single act of killing, but a series of anatomical messages, chillingly written in flesh, delivered by a blade, and witnessed by a nation. This was not justice. This was theater, and the curtain was only just beginning to rise. The first cut wasn't made by a blade. It was made by a rope. At Smithfield, the crowd was already thick, pressed together in an open field under a somber gray sky. They weren't there to watch justice. They were there to be entertained, to viscerally feel the power of the crown made visible not in gold or in law, but in the slow, deliberate destruction of a human being. William Wallace stood at the base of the scaffold, filthy, bleeding, and utterly broken from his drawing through the streets. But death would not come swiftly. Not yet, not even close. The first stage of his barbaric sentence was to be hanged, but crucially, not killed. In medieval England, hanging was not a precise science. There were no calculations of drop height to ensure a clean neck break. Instead, the condemned were often hoisted by hand, slowly strangled, their feet kicking just above the earth. But Wallace's hanging was never meant to be fatal. It was meant to simulate death and to pause just before it arrived. He was bound, his neck looped through a coarse rope, then hoisted into the air, not dropped, but lifted, so the hanging would be agonizingly gradual. Witnesses described him convulsing, gasping, his legs twitching violently, his face turning dark not from fear, but from oxygen starvation. His throat swelled, his tongue protruded, and just as unconsciousness threatened to steal him from the pain, he was cut down. He fell hard, likely unable to move, coughing, choking on his own saliva and blood, but still alive, still agonizingly awake, because the next acts required consciousness. This partial hanging was not punishment, it was preparation. It disoriented the senses, confused the brain, blurred the line between death and life. To the crowd, it was merely the opening act. To Wallace, it was the first fragment of his soul breaking loose. Modern psychologists would call it induced trauma. Military interrogators might call it controlled asphyxiation. In medieval England, it was simply a prelude, because the real pain hadn't even begun. Wallace now lay crumpled at the base of the scaffold, half dead, barely breathing, and utterly helpless. And that's exactly where his tormentors wanted him. He would be awake for what came next, because what came next required the victim to see it, feel it, and understand it. Not just for his sake, but for the terrified onlookers. This wasn't about removing a threat. This was about sending an unmistakable message. The body on the scaffold was no longer Wallace the man. It was Wallace the object, a canvas onto which the English crown would paint a chilling lesson in pain. As the hangman stepped back and pulled out a small, hooked knife, the performance shifted tone. No longer just spectacle, but now grotesque surgery. Wallace lay gasping on the scaffold, his neck swollen from the rope, his lungs still dragging air back into a body that had long begged to stop. But now came the part that no fiction has dared to truly show, because it would be almost unfilmable in its sheer, ritualized cruelty. The executioner didn't hesitate. There were no words, only a blade. And with that first slice, the true horror began. The knife was not meant for mercy. It was small, serrated, and used not to kill, but to open. The executioner began by castrating Wallace, severing his genitals, and holding them aloft for the crowd to see. They were then thrown into a fire directly in front of him, a symbolic annihilation of his masculinity, his legacy, his very future. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to the man who defies the crown. This is how the English destroy not just rebellion, but the very ability to reproduce it. But Wallace was still alive. He saw it. He felt it. And now came the part meant to push him to the absolute limits of human awareness. Next, the blade moved lower. With practiced, cold hands, the executioner sliced Wallace's abdomen, slowly and deliberately opening him up like a specimen. His intestines, feet upon feet of living tissue, were then drawn out of his body inch by excruciating inch. Each pull was a statement. Each exposed organ was a symbolic extraction of defiance. The crowd didn't see a man dying. They saw a body being turned inside out, piece by agonizing piece, as though stripping away his very essence. Wallace was conscious throughout. His body twitched. His chest heaved. According to several chroniclers, his eyes, still lucid, still blinking, followed the movements of his own viscera being burned in front of him. Imagine that. To watch your own insides feed a fire meant for public spectacle. This was not execution. This was ritualized deconstruction, a soul being forced to watch itself leave the body. Modern physiology tells us that a man in that condition might remain conscious for several minutes, especially if adrenaline and trauma shock keep the brain temporarily functional. Which means Wallace didn't just feel the knife. He likely heard his own breathing go ragged, felt his pulse weakening, smelled the sickening scent of his own burning flesh. The English chroniclers who approved of his death made sure to describe it not with shame, but with precision, because they wanted future readers to know that this was not simply justice. It was a political masterpiece, documented cruelty, a textbook for power, a blueprint for control. As the executioner finally reached into Wallace's chest, slicing through tissue to remove the still-beating heart, that performance reached its horrifying apex. The heart, the very symbol of courage, rebellion, and life, was ripped out and thrown onto the fire like the rest, a final, devastating gesture meant to say, "You are not just dead, you are undone." After Wallace's heart was torn from his chest, he was dead, or close enough that the line no longer mattered. What remained on the scaffold was not a man, but a symbol that the English crown intended to dismantle completely. Death in this context was never the goal. Control of the memory was paramount. And so, Edward I's executioners embarked on their final task, not to bury Wallace, nor even to simply discard him, but to fragment him piece by piece across geography, politics, and culture. They began with his head. It was removed with a clean cut, or at least as cleanly as medieval axes allowed. There was no reverence, no ceremony. The severed head was dipped in tar to preserve it, not for burial but for display. It was mounted on a pike and placed above the southern gatehouse of London Bridge, facing outward, a grisly warning to every traveler entering the city. There, amidst the grime and smoke of the capital, Wallace's head became a message carved in bone and gristle. This is what defiance looks like. This is the price of rebellion. But that was only the beginning. His body was then quartered, a violent process in which the torso and limbs were hacked apart using axes and knives. Each quarter was then assigned a destination, chosen not at random but for maximum psychological and political effect. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, a city bordering Scotland, a constant looming reminder to any would-be Scottish rebels that the Empire watched every movement. Another was sent to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a contested town often caught in the tug-of-war between England and Scotland. The third was sent to Stirling, where Wallace had claimed his greatest victory. The last to Perth, another site of resistance. These were not burial sites, they were billboards of horror. Each piece of Wallace's body was nailed up, mounted, or hung in the public square, where they rotted in the open air, not hidden from view, but deliberately positioned to be seen. And seen they were. Children saw them, clergy passed them, merchants walked beneath them. Every person who looked up at those dismembered parts of William Wallace was being re-educated, taught to understand the consequences of sedition not through words, but through viscera. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was imperial communication. It told every village, every hamlet, every soldier, you will not rise, you will not resist, because we do not merely kill, we dismantle. Wallace's body, now scattered across the land he once fought to free, became a macabre map, an anatomical warning stitched into the very soil of Britain. However, even in this final act of domination, the English crown failed in its most important objective. They didn't destroy him, not truly, because even as his limbs were nailed to gates and his head blackened in the London sun, the idea of Wallace began to grow, not in the cities that killed him, but in the very country he died for. In taverns and whispers, in smuggled songs and outlawed prayers, Wallace's story survived. And over time, his death became not a warning, but a prophecy, because the more Edward I tried to silence him with gruesome spectacle, the louder Wallace became. His body was gone, but the rebellion, the memory, the defiance, all had only just begun. His legacy transcended the brutality of his execution, transforming Wallace into an undying symbol of Scottish resistance and the spirit of freedom, a beacon for future generations.